Good afternoon and welcome to the Blue Sky Business Acquisitions Podcast. Today's sponsor is Squash CPA. Smart deals start with solid numbers. Squash CPA offers next generation quality of earnings to due diligence to help you navigate your deal confidently. Get started at squashcpa.com. Dave, as always, we appreciate your sponsorship. Today's episode is titled, Why Do Deals Fail in Today's Market? And we are blessed to have one of our co-hosts, Ben Woodward, who is one of the nation's top SBA lenders. He's also a Coleman Award winner for BDO of the Year last year, joining us today. Ben, this is our fourth podcast, and we get a lot of views in this. And you and I have worked together for 20 years. We grew up in banking together. I graduated over to the brokerage side, and you stayed a banker. You had one of your best years ever last year, doing more than 50 million. Tom and I closed 14 transactions last year, and I think in an ever-changing environment, buyers should understand, and sellers for that matter, should understand, why do deals fail. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to yourself so you can kind of dive deep into this and let everybody know what you're thinking.
Yeah, so first I'd like to say that I'm honored to have the opportunity to be on a podcast with two of the best brokers out there, and Matt Breselow and Tom Flanagan over at Sunbelt. It's been great to work with both of these guys. They've been great partners. So I'd just like to say that before we get into it. So today's topic is what causes deals to die either in the early stages or at the finish line, right? And it can happen for a variety of reasons. But I think we're going to go down the list and initially just line item them out, right? And then we're going to go down and just kind of have an open discussion on them. So the first one is poorly structured letter of intent, right? So what I've seen is if the letter of intent or the draft purchase agreement fail to line up how the working capital is going to be handled, how the transition agreement, the non-compete, key employees, the lease, or the assumption of leases. Those are some big things that, oftentimes buyers and sellers are just looking to get their deal penciled in. But what they don't realize is that buying a business is a grind. And when you get to the 10-yard line and you're up against the goal line defense, that nerves get frayed and negotiations can become more difficult. So it's better to have those negotiations on the front end and address those things early on. Another one is structure. How are you going to structure the deal? What is the entity? Oftentimes that is one of the last things that happens on a deal. And a buy team will leave their entity structure till the end. And then when they come up with their final structure, it's different than what they originally communicated at the front end. And so it can sometimes lead to an eligibility issue. Let's cover earnings adjustments, right? Like every year around this time is when tax returns get filed, year-end statements are in, and also policies have changed, whether it be at the economic level or at the lending level, right? And
you mean like the SBA quarterly update that just came out today?
Well, that's one of them, right? But let's there's all sorts of things that can happen. You can have new administrations, you can have new legislation come out, right? That changes the playing field, right? And so that can sometimes lead to changes in how things are going to cost for a business, whether it be labor, material costs, right? Things that go into the cost of goods sold and the operations of the business. So if you're looking at a business and you see a continuing trend line down and there's really no explanation for it, that can be a deal killer, because why is the business revenue declining? Why is the profitability declining? Is it because there was a concentration and they lost a key customer? Is it because of a regulatory change? Is it because of a strike? right, at maybe one of the suppliers that impacts the ability for the business to complete their production. So those are things that can lead to uh, a a deal falling apart at the end, right? You really have, like, I think the key thing in something like this, right, where whether it be on the buyer or on the seller side, it's full transparency, right? Because you need to be able to explain it. And maybe if there is some things that are happening within the business, maybe that's the time to have an honest conversation with guys like Matt or Tom and say, what are some things we can do to maybe not take this business out to market yet? Do we need to bring in a coach or something like that to improve the
Mhm.
financials of the company before we take it to market? And you guys have a lot of connections, and I have a lot of connections and guys that do that for a living to improve the bottom line of the business before it goes to market to maximize the multiple of the business. So
Well, I
those
think,
are some key things I've talked about. I'll turn it over to you guys to add your own opinions or ask questions.
yeah, and I think lots of good points there, Ben. There's really two sides of this, right? There's the sell side and the buy side. And last month we talked about buying right and making the smart decision, and really stacking your equity the way it needed to be, and having the right partners in your life. And from a seller's perspective, prepping to sell the company right 2 to 5 years in advance. Tom and I work with a couple of businesses right now that the sellers are 70 years old and they haven't made the appropriate steps to sell the company, and that reflects in the financials. And they're not going to get what they want for it, and they got 35 years running this, and it's something that I think hits home when you fail to plan, right? And
Yeah, and I like your analogy, Ben, as far as going down the field and getting to the 10-yard line, right? And trying to score the ball. Like sports has very similarities to this, a lot of them. And having a game plan, right, before you even get on the field, that's where if you are 2, 3, 5 years away from retirement age, is there a game plan, as far as succession and what does that look like? It doesn't mean that you need to implement it right away, but at least having those discussions, that's where Matt and I can help with that. But also, um, like you mentioned, there's so many different ways a deal can fall apart in the process, and lots of little roadblocks that I think we could, see, and we try to smooth those out and mitigate them, um, going through it, right? But being flexible both on sell side and buy side, and being able to call an audible when you need to, um, and understanding that you're probably going to need to at some point, and not being so rigid as far as the expectations, and have some fluidity, uh, as far as, price or terms, right? To make sure that you can get to, into the end zone at the end of the day.
right, and proper planning prevents poor performance, and that's been something that has been said to me my entire life. You got to make the right plans, but then so you're a seller, guys, and you make the right plans, and then you engage, right? We go live to market. I think one of the things that causes some of those pre-planned deals to fail is communication, right? If you have good things happen, or you have bad things happen, but you fail to communicate that with the broker, with the buyer, with counsel, with anybody, and they become surprises at the end of the day, I think those are one of the big things that can derail a transaction, good or bad, right? If something good happens and your price goes way up, or something bad happens and the price goes down, the buyer needs to shift and make an adjustment.
Yeah, there was a guy that when Matt and I worked at Associated, and we had some credit training, and they brought this individual in, and he was a longtime credit guy, right? And one of the things that he said, as you look at a deal, is like spread the deal, meaning spread the financials, right, within the accounting software, and then look at it side by side, right? And then build your question deck on the aberrations within the deal. So the big swings. So if one of them is like, oh man, it went from 2.5 million to 5 million in 1 year, and the sell side packet doesn't have anything into why that occurred, that's a question, right? If cost of goods sold is magically way down, right? What's going on within that? Or what's up with the inventory? The inventory balance keeps growing. Like those are some things that generate questions. So like if you're thinking about a deal, and this goes for like both buyer and seller, like put the deal down. If you don't have accounting software, put it in an Excel spreadsheet and look at it side by side and do a change column, right, to show the year to year changes in it. And if you got pretty significant wild swings or aberrations, as this trainer said, you probably should formulate the questions. And that goes the same with projections too, right? If you're building out projections and all of a sudden you're saying, I'm going to grow revenue by 25%, but there's no story behind it, except you're going to run a Facebook ad campaign, right? That's probably not going to drive revenue 25%. And you got to be realistic about it, because at the end of the day, if you're a buyer and you're signing up for a deal, right, you're personally guaranteeing it, and no matter what, you have to make the payment. You owe the money, so you want to make sure you have a concise plan. Going back to like the beginning topic on this is what kills deals. Buyers can have a situation where they poorly execute on their plan. One of the things that I think is most important to the deal is who's the buyer, like what is their background, who's on the team, what is their background, how does it translate into them buying this business, right? And it's not just that, but you also look at their business plan and their projections. Are they well thought out? Are they executed? Right? It's like we've all seen NFL teams like the Chicago Bears, right? That
Bears.
run a poorly executed team, right? Well, that goes the same for buyers and their plan that they're presenting to the bank and what their story is, right? Like you could be the best looking person on paper, but if you have poor presentation skills, like that's going to translate into the operations of your business, right? And what we look at when we're looking at a deal, like, and there's a lot of resources, right? SBA.gov has a whole section on traditional business plan writing, right? So it's not hard to find the resources to write the business plan. And there's also free resources out there at small business development centers throughout the country that are tied to universities, where guys that are thinking about buying a business that just maybe want some brief coaching, right? But they can, once they got the template, they can do it on their own, right? Those small business development centers that are usually former bankers will help these buyers for relatively no cost to low cost put together a plan to get it ready for financing at a bank.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Ben, I have a question for you, because obviously there could be, let's say there's a customer concentration, not necessarily issue, but they have, a larger percent of the revenue is concentrated with one customer, and the buyer's experience isn't quite directly related to the business, right? And you kind of stack a couple risks right on top of each other. How are you looking at that? How are you, evaluating, that combination? I know it can be deal specific, so it's a little bit of a difficult question to fully answer, but you know, I think there's a number of deals that have multiple factors that maybe you may consider, risky, right? Um, but how do you like those to also be, mitigated, right? How would you prefer to see certain deals structured to help decrease that risk on your end?
Yeah, so Tom, I think that's a really great question, right? Like usually what I look at is, okay, if I'm looking at a deal, do I have 1 to 2 weaknesses? that I can mitigate with supporting documentation, whether that be secondary sources of repayment, large post-close liquidity, a long-term contract that's in place that goes out for most of the term of our SBA loan. But if I start to get to three negatives on a deal, right, it becomes very hard to do that deal, right? Because now you're having to explain more on the deal, right? So like if you got someone that has, like, maybe they pay their bills, but they pay them late all the time, right? That's a sign of how they're going to pay you, right? So like if you got maybe 1 30-day or 2 30 days out there, but the accounts are mostly paid as agreed and it's a one-off, right? Pretty easy to get around. And that probably knocks the credit score, like probably into the low 700s, upper sixes, right? So look, you can mitigate that with a letter of explanation in the file. Customer concentration, that's a tough one, right? Because like being in Wisconsin and looking at a lot of manufacturers, a lot of times the manufacturers have 1 to 2 large customers. And I have seen like where a business has been working with that customer for 30 years, and then the company outsources the entire production line to China, and all of a sudden that business is gone from that supplier, right? And it's over there now, and they've lost their entire business model. So like there better be a pretty good case on customer concentration to mitigate, right? Like a new customer coming in, or maybe a long-term contract, right? But if it's like, hey, I've got this business and my customer concentration is 90% with this one customer, like that's not really what the SBA like guarantees used to like allow you to do that deal. Technically, I would call that business basically a really a business within the business of that company, right?
Yeah,
That's
an
all.
extension of the business.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like
I think
here's what I do, Tom. I have like 5 or 6 things I really look at when I'm doing my write-up, right? And I've gotten a little more extensive in it primarily because I've wanted to basically build out my memo to kind of try to address as many questions on the front end as I can versus having the underwriter come up with them, right? But, I look at how the deal's structured, right? So what the entity is, like asset, stock, membership purchase, like that. I look at how the capital's stacked, right? How much is coming in? Does what the PFSs of our guarantors, like, do they have a bank statement that matches to the PFS that shows, yes, they have the money to put into the deal, right? I look at resumes to see how does their resume translate into buying this business. I look at their tax return too to see, okay, number one, do they have a history of earning the income that they say they do? Do we have a secondary repayment, right, from maybe someone else that could guarantee the deal? I look at the PFS and I say, okay, between the business and the collateral and the PFS, do I have additional collateral that I can use to add some strength to the deal? Because even though I have an SBA guarantee, I have to take all available collateral. And while collateral is not a reason to do a deal, it is a mitigant against a weakness in the deal, right? I look at their credit bureau to make sure they pay their bills on time. I look at post-close liquidity. So I look at the purchase agreement to see what working capital is being left in the deal, what I have to fund. Like, does the guarantor have additional liquidity if they get into a situation post-close that they could ride out a storm, right? I look at those things that we talked about: transition, non-compete, right? Employees coming over. I look at the customer lists. I look at how they pay. Same with the suppliers, right? What their inventory is. I look at all those things and I try to put the deal together. So hopefully in a roundabout way, I've answered your question.
Well, I
Yeah,
think
that's very helpful.
yeah, Ben, agreed. And I think the biggest thing is a lot of those are pre-mitigants, right? We're taking the transaction and we're saying, okay, we got all these items that lead up into an approval. once that we get that approval, right, what the things that are required to get that loan into closing and eventually, allow everybody to achieve the goal, right? The seller gets the paycheck, they get to sell the business. The buyer gets to obtain the business and recognize revenue, right? You, the banker, get to book a loan. We, the broker, we get to, sell a business and earn a commission. And, so everyone's happy when the deal closes. I think in a lot of cases is that we focus so much on prepping the seller to sell, and we want to maximize not only the bite of the apple for the seller, but a buyer's ROI and then the risk factor to the bank, right? Because all three kind of work in tandem. You got to have that three-legged stool. So we've all done a good job of getting buyer and seller to the approval letter, right? The commitment letter. Now we're in closing. We get this big closing checklist, and I think that is a really that opens up the doors in a lot of cases for third parties to come in and toss a wrench into this. I was working on a foundry one time and we got a commitment letter. We're in closing, and lo and behold, we cannot find an insurance company that'll insure a foundry. Well, that's a condition of closing. So that deal ended up dying. Now they ended up buying it later on down the road, and it all ended well. But that was a reason, insurance coming in and not being able to meet the minimum needs standards for the buyer or the bank is a reason why that deal got declined.
Right. There's those, phase ones, right? And then something comes back a little, it's not definitive, and then you need a phase two. I don't know if there's ways to mitigate that.
I love when we have the environmental conversation, because Ben, how many times in your career have you had a deal that cash flowed well and the RSRA comes back with a warning? You go out, you do a phase one, and you realize that you got to go do a phase two, and you go do the core samples, and it's petroleum or a hazardous material in the soil, and remediation is going to be $50,000 to $100,000. You want to talk about a kick in the gut?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think that like a situation like that potentially comes to a restructure of the deal, like whether you want to include the real estate on it, right? Because like the thing about environmentals, and like you do not want somebody else's problem, right? Like the last thing you want to do as a business is buy something that has a high cost thing or high cost issue, and then you buy it and now you own it, right? And the seller's out. Like it's now your responsibility, right? Like you saw that a lot in the early 2000s and really right after the recession, right, where you had all of these foreclosures, and then the building was contaminated. So it's real risk. I had a situation on a deal where we had an environmental, and they drilled and it came back with an elevated level, right? But it was below the standard, but it triggered we better do another investigation. One of the things in talking with the environmental company is a speck of asphalt could cause that. So when you're drilling a core in an asphalt parking lot, right, you could probably get
Probably gonna be a
contaminants in it.
spec. Yeah.
So they drilled another hole right near it, and they didn't come back with the same contamination. And so therefore, like it was able to move forward. But like in order to do that, they were charging, an extra amount of money to drill that second core. So like it ended up working out, right? And that's like a situation for a buyer, like, okay, what if this core comes back and I've just spent another amount of money? So that comes to, okay, you're getting to that situation where potential phase two is coming in, right? Who's carrying the cost of that phase two, right? If the buyer is buying the business, but do they want to pay 150 grand to complete a phase two and get the remediation done? I don't think so. So really it comes down to like the seller's willingness to handle the cleanup, or buyer and seller's agreement to agree on a suitable resolution to deal with it, right? Like, I don't know, I haven't had a lot of real estate transactions, so haven't had a lot of environmental issues lately on deals. But I have had them in the past. They weren't easy, but got through them, right? It just really comes down to buyer and seller's interest in doing the deal, and how long do they want to stay in it, and are they willing to ride it out for it to come to completion, with the realization that the outcome may be that you spent a bunch of money, but your deal's not closing.
Right. Third party
No one
reports.
wants to be at that point, right?
Yeah,
Gotta
third
love
part-
those.
Yeah, valuations at times, like business valuations, they can come in low, right?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, right? So how many times are you doing a loan where the third party, valuation company, right? We know a couple of GCF, AMP, right? Mark over at AMP. How many times is the purchase price being outplaced by the valuation? How many times is the appraisal coming in below?
So lately it's relatively low. I'd say in 2017 and 18, there were more instances of the valuation coming in low, where you had to adjust, right? Because SBA says you can only pay up to the value of the valuation, and so anything over that either needs to be more equity in, lower purchase price, bigger seller note, right? So to address that, lately I haven't seen it. I'm not saying it can't pop itself back up, right? Because valuations are a point in time at a time in the market, right? So, what may be a value now may not be a value later.
Right. I think, when we talk about why do deals fail, I mean, there's so many different variables that pull into these, right? And all of this is very complex. So, I mean, when you think about you got to have communication, you got to have cash flow, you got to have a commitment from a buyer, right? And I've said it before. I mean, what I look for in buyers is someone that's not just going to dip their toe in the pond, they're going to jump in, they're going to commit to it, right? But then you got all these third party things. So, I mean, I'm a firm believer that you gotta, I mean, three things get you across the finish line in a transaction: price, terms, and trust. And I think when you have a really good buyer that's got a good relationship with a seller, and the time has been built to foster that relationship during the underwriting process, during loan approval, during diligence, and you're having good quality relationship building conversations, I think it minimizes these nasties that can come in later because you have an agreeable force. But I think it's when you don't have upfront communication, you're not fostering that. If you get to the commitment letter and a buyer still has questions on the business, like I think a miss. And I think that's a miss on the broker's side of it, right? Because that means the broker didn't do a good enough job of bringing buyer and seller together after binding acceptance to build and cultivate an initial relationship. So I think that is a key component to these.
Yeah, I mean, you need all parties to be able to be flexible and open to changes. I mean, it's sort of like dating, and then you move in with the girl, and then, you have your first fight, and it's like, I'm not marrying her, like it's a marriage at the end of the day, when you're closing on a deal, um, and, if you can't work through, a small speed bump at the end of the day and have the end goal in mind as far as whether you're the buyer or the seller, right? And be able to be flexible and adjust expectations based off of what's happening, because things are changing damn near daily, so, and that comes, it falls onto us, Matt, too, as far as setting that and explaining it. and then providing Ben the best, package we can. I guess, Ben, what are some of those things that brokers can do to make sure that you're confident, right? Moving forward with a deal.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you guys just hit on the head, right, is having calm heads, right? Calm heads prevail, right? So having an engaged buyer, seller, selling team, buying team, right? That aren't going to put conflict into the deal, right? And add drama, right? One of the things that can derail a deal is someone being an antagonist in the relationship, right? We at the bank aren't trying to like stop your deal. We're trying to communicate out like things that need to take place and structural changes that may need to happen in order for it to work, right? And it's not to make the buyer's life difficult, right? Or because we don't like the deal, it's because we have to do it, right? So it's taking it in stride. Patience is a key virtue, right? And not going to a scorched earth strategy, because as soon as you scorch the earth, there's no returning back from scorched earth, right? So, like basically,
Right.
if you're scorching the earth, you're deciding that you're ending the relationship. So, like those are things to keep in mind. You can always have fair, honest, transparent conversations, but it's hard to unwind significant damage done in a deal because someone's like being a jerk.
No. Honestly, Ben, lots of great points. I mean, we covered everything from clear, concise communication to presenting a strong, healthy LOI, focus on working capital. We talked about buyer misalignment, experience, and performance, right? I think the one thing we miss is culture. I think in a lot of cases, when you got a seller that's cultivated a really good culture within a company, to have a buyer come in, they got to match that same energy, right? Otherwise, bad things happen. And then economic conditions, and I mean, that's a good way to be, because as a buyer, you're buying this company not for the short term, you're going to buy it for the long term. So you're going to buy it through the highs and the lows. And I think having a plan in place to navigate that is important. So, yeah, Ben, I'll leave you with some final thoughts.
Well, look, at the end of the day, when you all put the deal together and you make it across the goal line, we all get the John Madden turkey leg, right?
Absolutely.
Making me hungry. Yeah, I think on sell side, right, we didn't really quite touch more on that, but I think from our side, I don't think, Ben, you even get to this point, right? Because a lot of times we may have a business out to market and we don't even receive an LOI, or maybe we do, but it just doesn't match the seller's expectations, right? And I think that's on us, Matt, as far as defining those expectations um, and providing that communication so they understand. But if you're a seller and you receive a couple LOIs and they're all below the value you feel that your business is worth, but you're really trying to sell, right? You got to look kind of at a broader perspective and where's the market? Interest rates are a bit higher. Revenues decreased year over year for the last 3 years, maybe even EBITDA, right? And and having the right expectations and the right mindset going into selling is huge. So we can touch on that on another podcast maybe, but But this is super informative, great content. Next month, we're going into buy side again, and
Buy side.
what to do once you close, and that'll be exciting. May bring on another special guest. We'll see. Keep you on your toes. But if you're listening to this too and have any questions or want us to identify any specific topics, happy to do that.
Wonderful. Well, Ben, Tom, thanks guys for the time today. To the listeners out there, we're on Spotify and YouTube. Hit us a like, follow, and a subscribe. And as always, we'll see you next time.